Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Trends Relevant to the Boards of Ordained Ministry. My name is Doug Poe, and I am the director of the Lewis Center for Church Leadership, and I am glad you're all joining us today. Please join me in a word of prayer. Gracious God, we're so thankful for this day. We're so thankful for all of us who are together thinking about your church and the work that we can do to transform lives. We ask, Lord, that we would have a conversation so that we can truly touch more people. We ask all of this in your Son's name. Amen. Again, I welcome you to this time that we have together. And let me just share a little bit with you about the Religious Workforce Project, off of which the data we're sharing is based. This has been a multi-year project. It started actually before the pandemic and went through the pandemic, and we're continuing it now. And this project has both a qualitative and a quantitative piece. The qualitative piece, we've studied about 40 congregations within the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. The quantitative piece, most of the data we're sharing today, we've used data and statistics provided by multiple denominations. And I do want to say that a lot of the data focuses on the solo pastor or the lead pastor of a congregation. But Dr. Lovett Weems will unpack that in a little bit as you hear him talk. The other thing that I want to share with you related to this is that we will be sharing with you 10 research reports that are going to come out of the work that has taken place, and some of the feedback we're hoping you will give us as a follow-up survey to what is being shared today. So please fill out your survey. You will receive it immediately after the webinar because you will play a role in the final report we release. In that final report, not only will you have the trends, but you will also learn some of the implications and recommendations based upon those trends for where we believe, in particular, the United Methodist Church needs to go in the future. I'm excited to welcome Dr. Lovett Weems, who is the founding director of the Lewis Center for Church Leadership and continues to be our senior consultant. He has played an instrumental role in doing the research critical for this project. He has worked with Dr. Amy Kubicek, and he will lead us through our slides this morning. Dr. Weems.
Thank you, Doug, and welcome to everyone. We began with a series of congregational trends impacting the religious workforce. We need to move to the next slide. Thank you. We cover a 20-year period from 2000 to 2019, ending just before the pandemic that skewed many statistics. Also keep in mind that the pandemic didn't change most of the trends we will review, but rather accelerated existing trends. These statistics also end before disaffiliations began. However, these congregational trends should remain after disaffiliation, since seceding churches and staying churches are the same size. Where clergy trends diverge somewhat may occur from these trends among pastors of disaffiliating churches. That is, leaving pastors are somewhat less likely to be elders. Leaving pastors are somewhat less likely to be women. Leaving pastors are significantly less likely to be people of color. The first congregational trend we examine is declining attendance. After stable and sometimes increasing attendance in the 1990s and an uptick in 2001 following 9/11. Attendance began a decline in 2002 that continues to the present. In fact, the pace of decline is accelerating. This is happening across denominations. Notice that the median worship attendance was 53 in 2000 and declined to 38 by 2019. Median means that half of the churches have larger attendance than the median, and half of churches have smaller attendance than the median. The second trend is fewer new adherents. This refers to how many people are making first-time professions of faith each year. The chart on the left shows that in 2000, churches received one new profession of faith for every 20 average worship attendance. By 2019, the effectiveness of reaching new professions of faith declined by 50% to one profession of faith for every 30 average attendance. The chart at the right looks at professions of faith in relationship to deaths from 1968 to 2019. Throughout Methodist history, the number of new believers each year has far surpassed the number of deaths. This changed in 2019 when deaths exceeded professions of faith. The third congregational trend is more small churches, a trend with immediate implications for the deployment of clergy. There were 5,000 fewer United Methodist churches in 2019 than in 2000. This chart shows where the changes came based on size. The columns represent groupings of churches by attendance. The columns begin on the left with churches with 1,000 or more attendance. Each size group gets smaller as you move to the right, with the last column to the right representing churches with 25 or fewer attendance. For example, on the far left, you see that in 2019, the number of churches with attendance of 1,000 or more had grown by 1%. However, the next column shows that in 2019, the number of churches averaging between 501 and 999 in worship decreased by 41%. In fact, you see there were fewer churches in 2019 than in 2000 in every group except for the largest, 1,000 or more attendance, and the very smallest, those with 25 or fewer attendance. That means that the 5,000 fewer churches number needs context. In fact, in 2019, there were 7,292 fewer churches with 26 or more attendance than in 2000. On the other hand, in 2019, there were 2,059 more churches with 25 or fewer attendance than in 2000. A fourth congregational trend is that churches are spending a somewhat higher percentage of their budgets on personnel. The proportion of budgets going for staffing increased 5 percentage points between 2000 and 2019, from 42% to 46%. The decreases came primarily in spending on facilities. A fifth congregational trend also relates to personnel spending. Churches are now spending a higher percentage of their personnel spending on non-clergy staff. United Methodist Statistics began dividing spending on clergy and non-clergy staff in 1989. This chart shows that in 1989, 72% of all personnel spending went for clergy compensation, with only 28% for non-clergy staff. However, by 2019, the two lines come much closer together, showing that 53% of personnel spending went for clergy and 47% went for non-clergy staff. This trend is true across all sizes of churches, though non-clergy staff is far more prominent as churches become larger. We now turn to a new section. Changing congregational trends tend to lead to changing clergy patterns. We begin with changes in clergy deployment. We first see changes in what types of clergy are deployed to serve as solo or lead pastors of congregations. These charts distinguish clergy in three groupings. Category 1, shown in blue, represents elders and occasionally deacons assigned as solo and lead pastors. Category 2, shown in red, includes local pastors and associate members. Category 3, green, represents certified lay ministers, but primarily lay supply pastors. The chart to the left shows changes in the numbers from each category between 2000 and 2019. Keep in mind that these numbers represent the number of churches served by different types of clergy. Notice the dramatic drop in churches served by an elder compared to the increased numbers of churches served by others. Since the number of total churches changed significantly between 2000 and 2019, the two other charts that show percentages may be more revealing. Churches served by elders represented 64% of all churches in 2000, but only 48% in 2019. Most of the difference was filled by local pastors, with some from lay supply pastors. Speaking of local pastors, notice that the growth in churches served by local pastors has come primarily from part-time local pastors. These charts show the numbers, the left chart, and percentages, the right chart, of churches served by full-time and part-time local pastors in 2000 and 2019. Part-time local pastors served 22% of churches in 2019, up from 12% in 2000. Let's look at one more area where clergy types are deployed differently in 2019 than in 2000. This shows what types of clergy are assigned as full-time associate staff. Notice that in 2000, chart to the left, 75% of full-time associates were elders, showing in red. By 2019, the percentage declined to 51%. The gap was filled by local pastors and deacons, each doubling their percentage representation between 2000 and 2019, with local pastors, green, going from 12% to 26%, and deacons, blue, going from 11% to 22%. We now turn to examine the impact of congregational trends on clergy education patterns. There is a substantial increase in the percentage of solo or lead pastors with no seminary degree in 2019 compared to 2000. Pastors with an MDiv degree are shown in blue. In 2000, chart to the left, they represented 64% of pastors. By 2019, chart to the right, they were 48% of pastors. Course of study pastors, shown in red, went from 26% in 2000 to 38% in 2019. Lay pastors with varied training, shown in green, went from 10% in 2000 to 14% in 2019. Given the increasing number of pastors with no seminary degree, it will not be surprising to see that seminary enrollment is declining. The chart on the left shows enrollment of all mainline denominational students in any ATS-accredited seminary between 2000 and 2019. The blue portion shows a 50% decline in MDiv enrollment. The red portion shows a more modest decline in other professional master's degrees. The chart to the right shows specifically United Methodist students enrolled at all ATS schools during the same years. The declining trend for United Methodist is similar to that shown for the main line as a whole. As the previous chart suggests, denominations beyond the United Methodist Church are facing similar changes and challenges. Evangelical and Black Protestant traditions have historically provided for multiple ways for persons to qualify to serve as pastors, thus requiring fewer adjustments in recent years. But today, pastoral leaders beyond ordained clergy with seminary degrees are needed more for pastoral leadership among all traditions. Mainline Protestants, because of declining church sizes, have required the most adjustment to new circumstances. United Methodists have had the course of study educational route to ministry from almost the very beginning in the United States. Today, other mainline denominations that once required the MDiv for its clergy now are developing some alternate education routes to ministry, though used far more sparingly than we use the course of study. One example is the theological education for emerging ministries used by the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. As with the course of study, these programs are done in partnership with their denominational seminaries. The other shift among mainline denominations is the use of lay pastors. Some of the names of these pastors are listed here. The lay pastor programs have some common features across denominations. Denominations normally delegate decisions to regions, including whether they are utilized. Lay ministry usage varies by region based on need. Lay ministers normally have authority in a specific setting of ministry only. Responsibilities for training are usually left with regional or local bodies. Most lay ministers are older, often retired. Educational scope and quality vary considerably, even within the same tradition. All these changes impact clergy demographics. We begin by looking at trends in the age of clergy. Most of us know that there has been a tremendous aging of United Methodist clergy in recent years. These charts show changes between 2000 and 2019. The chart on the left shows actual numbers by age. Blue columns, Blue columns represent the numbers in 2000. In red columns, the numbers in 2019. From left to right, the age cohorts are under 35, 34 to 54, 55 to 72, and older than 72 retired clergy. The other two charts to the right show percentages for 2000, the center chart, and 2019, the right chart. Young clergy show historically low percentages throughout the 20 years. Biggest shifts come in the major decline in clergy ages 35 to 54, and the increase in clergy 55 and older. While under 35 clergy have made up an atypical percentage of clergy for a while, we see in the most recent years an accelerating decline. Notice how modest annual decreases have become more dramatic since 2019. To put United Methodist clergy ages in perspective, let's look at them compared to some benchmarks. These columns show age groups using blue for under 35, red for 35 to 54, and green for 55 to 72. The column on the far left shows the age breakdown of the U.S. population, ages 25 to 72. The columns that follow to the right show clergy age breakdowns for Black Protestant, Evangelical Protestant, Mainline Protestant, and Roman Catholic traditions. You will see that there is a dramatic and unprecedented gap between the makeup of the population, ages 25 to 34, and the scarcity of clergy younger than 35 in all religious traditions. We next turn to trends related to clergy gender. The chart on the left shows actual numbers of churches served by male or female solo or lead pastors in 5-year intervals, beginning in 2000 and ending in 2019. Blue columns represent men and red columns represent women. The common trend is fewer churches served each year by men and more by women. The other two charts to the right show percentages where churches served by men changed from 80% in 2000 to 71% in 2019, and the corresponding change for women from 20% in 2000 to 29% in 2019. Keep in mind that these numbers and percentages do not reflect the total number of clergymen or clergywomen, but rather the churches served by a male or female solo or lead pastor in these years. In this chart, the blue columns represent women MDiv graduates, and the red columns represent women solo or lead pastors. The comparisons are for 3 religious traditions: Black Protestant left, Evangelical Protestant center, and Mainline Protestant right. For many years now, the percentage of women MDiv graduates from seminaries has surpassed their presence as lead pastors. We now look at comparisons across specific denominations for what percentage of churches have women as solo or lead pastors in 2000 and 2019. The blue columns represent 2000 percentages, with red columns designating 2019 percentages. Women as lead pastors have increased since 2000 in all of these denominations. This chart looks at changes in the attendance size of churches served by men and by women in 2000 and 2019. The blue columns represent 2000 percentages, with red columns designating 2019 percentages. Each column shows how the median attendance of churches served by women was compared to churches served by men in each of the 2 years. For example, in the last columns to the right, in the United Methodist Church, clergy women served churches in 2000 with 69% of the median attendance as those served by clergy men. By 2019, they were serving churches with median attendance of 76% of those served by men. The percentage of churches with 251 or more attendance led by clergy women is up, though progress is limited and varies considerably across denominations. For each of the denominations shown in this chart, 3 percentages are shown. The first column in each set, blue, shows the percentage of churches with 251 or more attendance with women solo or lead pastors in 2000. The second column in each set, red, shows the percentage of churches with 251 or more attendance with women solo or lead pastors in 2019. The third column in each set, green, shows the percentage of all churches served by clergy women in 2019. Looking at the United Methodist columns on the far right, you see that in 2000, 7% of churches with 251 or more attendance were served by women. By 2019, that percentage was 15%. The 15% compares to 29% of all churches served by women. One final word on gender comparisons takes us back to the early slides showing how the makeup of the church pool had changed in 2 decades. We need to remember that gains in parity for clergy women come within a context of congregational decline. That means more limited opportunities for both women and men. We now turn to trends related to clergy race. Historical and cultural factors in the U.S. have shaped the racial and ethnic composition of congregations and clergy across Christian traditions. No predominantly white denomination has a history to which they can look with pride. Since 2000, the greatest growth in racial and ethnic diversity among clergy occurred in the Roman Catholic tradition, especially the increasing share of Hispanic priests. Clergy race analysis in the United Methodist Church is difficult because racial designations for clergy are not part of the statistical reports. Few denominations do so. However, where that information is linked to statistical data, the same analysis we did for gender could be done for race. We were able to do that detailed analysis, for example, for the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, because they designate clergy race. Across mainline denominations, about 90% of solo or lead pastors are white, about the same as the racial membership of these denominations. There is some growing diversity among mainline clergy. This should continue given the increased racial and ethnic diversity of MDiv graduates from mainline seminaries over the past 2 decades. This chart shows the racial and ethnic breakdown of MDiv graduates from mainline seminaries for 1998 2006, 2012, and 2018. The white percentage of MDiv graduates declined from 84% in 1998 to 69% in 2018. The greatest percentage growth has come among Black MDiv graduates, with more modest gains for Hispanic and Asian graduates. We now turn to a discussion time. We will begin by taking any questions for clarification of the information presented, and then we hope as soon as possible to turn to the question of what implications you see for these trends on the United Methodist Church, especially on your work in boards of ordained ministry. So perhaps you've begun using the chat function to include some questions that you'd like to ask about for clarification about some of the information presented, and then we can have a more general conversation. Matt will monitor the questions coming in and pass them along.
Dr. Weems, we have someone who says they are very impressed with the figures, but they wonder, where has all this data come from?
Yes, well, in the case of the United Methodist Church, we have a lot of data. As my friend, who's now Bishop Tom Berlin, used to say, United Methodist clergy know that they have to report every statistic there is, but that they'll not be held accountable for any of it. So we have a lot of data, and that's where it comes from, primarily in the statistical reports that every church completes and turns in at the end of the year. Or where we're looking outside the United Methodist Church, we have figures that have been shared with us from 6 or 7 other denominations that keep good annual statistics, and for that we're very grateful. And then when we're talking about traditions such as mainline Protestant, evangelical Protestant, etc., we typically depend on the National Congregation Survey that's done every few years.
All right, another question. Do we have a sense of how departure to the GMC and other conservative denominations might have changed these stats for the UMC?
Yes, what I alluded to was that the overall trends, especially about congregations, should not change, because through the first 6,000 plus disaffiliations, the median worship attendance of those leaving was 38, and the median worship attendance of those staying was 38. And the disaffiliations that have taken place since June 30th have not shown any indication of changing that trend. So what does that mean? The congregational trends tend to follow church size. You could see that in some of the cases where we divided by church sizes. That is, a church with 25 in worship will have far more in common with a church on the other side of the country with 25 in worship than it will with a church in the same county that has hundreds of people in worship. So whether it's likelihood of growing, professions of faith, finances, those tend to be very related to attendance size. So even though the pool will be smaller in the United Methodist Church once disaffiliations end on December 31, the overall trajectory of trends should remain the same.
Another question. In the slides regarding lead pastors and associates, it would be interesting to know how many of the churches that 20 years ago were appointed associates had to downsize and now have just one appointed pastor.
Yeah, there are probably a number of those. There were about the same number of churches that had 2 or more full-time clergy in 2019 as 2000, but as is indicated, the number of those clergy associates may be coming down, but also the greater reliance on part-time, both clergy and lay, are affecting that.
Dr. Weems, COVID and disaffiliation have had a major impact. What kind of trends are we looking at since 2019?
Well, yeah, the United Methodist Church has faced a disaster and a tragedy. The disaster was the pandemic, and the tragedy is disaffiliation, in my judgment. And the pandemic is, as I said, it tended to accelerate trends. How churches are coming back from the pandemic may be varying based on a number of factors, but again, size of church may be a part. As I work with churches and talk with students who are in churches, there's quite a range on what things are looking like compared to the pre-pandemic. But keep in mind, we've been on a decline, like in attendance, since 2002. So if there had been no pandemic, we would have had lower attendance in all likelihood. So I think the basic patterns are going to remain the same. How churches relate to their communities is going to be more of the issue, I think. If the focus is strictly on getting back to so-called normal before the pandemic, then that's going to be tragic, because before the pandemic, the normal wasn't that great to begin with. Each year, for many, many years, we were doing ministry in a way that withdrew our presence and our witness from within the United States. So I think we've got to go back to something more like the earliest days, where we fall in love with our communities again and get re-engaged, and not spend inordinate focus on kind of regrouping, getting the folks back. We'd love to have everybody back, but realizing that God's given us a lot of other people too.
Another question, Dr. Weems. How do you see the University Senate decision to allow MDivs to be fully online affecting recruitment and education of clergy?
Well, it makes it more accessible, but I think what boards of ordained ministry are going to have to look at is what type of formation for ministry is taking place during that degree. To what extent do they have mentors, and how are those being utilized? it's hard to do ministry at a laptop. You've got to have some interaction. You've got to be able to engage. So it's there are a lot of possibilities with technology, and all seminaries are using it a good bit. And for certain types of courses, it seems to work very well. But I think it means that boards of ordained ministry are going to have to look far more closely at the way a person has been formed for ministry, both in their spiritual development and church experience, as well as through theological education.
Dr. Weems, here's a question I think you've looked into quite a bit. Do you have any data about why clergy in the 34-year-old category have declined so steeply?
Well, part of it is their absence from congregations. When we did several years ago a survey of under 35 clergy, we found that the most common characteristics were they were active in church as children, and they were active in church as youth. And you can't go 50 years with fewer children each year and fewer youth each year and expect to have the same results on that. The growth in the nuns, those claiming no religious affiliation, that figure stayed at about 3% or so for decades. And then in the 1990s, it started going up. It's leveled off a little bit, but it's gone far higher. And those are almost totally younger people, not exclusively. So that's taking out a group. And so there are a lot of factors, a lot of things the church itself has got to look at itself for. There are factors in the culture, and it is a trend across other denominations as well.
This is more of a comment than a question, but with the decline in worship attendance and number of UMC churches and the increase in numbers of part-time local pastors, I expect the role of Boom in supporting and providing further training for LLPs will increase. And tagging onto that comment, that means that more intentional connections between Boom and DCOMs will be needed to ensure LLPs get the same reviews and education resources.
Oh, that is a critical point to be made. I think we've got to come to look at things very differently. And the relationship of the conference board and district committees has got to increase, because if your focus is on elders and deacons only, then you are focusing on a shrinking percentage of the clergy that are impacting the congregations in the conference. So that can be very, very important. There's so many implications of what these trends mean. But we have an even bigger issue, perhaps, and that is with the thousands of certified lay ministers, a few hundred of those, but the larger number of lay supply pastors. The because of our denominational insistence on drawing a hard line between lay and clergy, the certified lay minister, for example, has to stay on the lay side. And that means that in annual conferences, unless there is a deliberate effort of getting some kind of coordination in the training, this is all going to fall on the lay side. Well, those certified lay ministers who are serving as pastors are functionally no different than the course of study pastor or even an elder, in the sense that when they arrive at a church, they are seen as pastor. And what they do in terms of functioning is as a pastor. So having that hard line on the lay side makes it hard to get both the training they need and the accountability that they may need. So that's something we really need to look at. I think we need to go back to the drawing board, and boards of ordained ministry have got to be the leaders in this. But we've got to start looking at the whole picture as one, and then look at the distinctions of various types of clergy, not based on privilege or something, but based on function and calling of what's appropriate, and then what kind of training is appropriate and what kind of accountability is appropriate given these various roles.
Another question, Dr. Weems. I'm sorry, are you finished?
No, go right ahead. But also, I'd invite people to contribute if you think there may be other implications for the denomination or for the work of boards of ordained ministry, to share those. We'll give you an opportunity through a survey later today. But if you have ideas to share about things you think this may mean going forward, go ahead, Matt.
Dr. Weems, well, how can boards of ordained ministry recruit new and younger clergy, and what do boards need to take into consideration as clergy are aging?
Well, the pool of clergy, to begin with the aging part, 55 to 72, it used to be about 35%. Then it reached a high, maybe a 53% a few years ago, and it's been leveling off at 52, 51%. But that's still a lot of clergy in that age group. So they're going to continue to be lots of retirements, and annual conferences are seeing this, 17 people retire and 2 people entering, and some of that's going to continue. So being aware that that transition is going on, but what's happening on the size of churches is making a big difference also. I think with younger clergy, the temptation is to try to do something quickly, and that will produce immediate results, like have an enlistment Saturday event or something. But I think what we've got to do is to go back and see where. I would start by looking at the younger clergy that have come in. Where did they come from? What do they have in common? Who do they know that didn't choose ministry who may have felt called to it, and see if you can find any living edges there. Is it a congregation? Is it a Wesley Foundation? Is it a particular pastor that is encouraging? And go back from there. I think working with the conference around children's and youth ministry, it's just not the work of Board of Ordained Ministry, but there's got to be more of these feeder systems. And then how do you find a way to do something with those who may be lifting their hands? So if there is a way to identify some who can come together, chances are that if there's someone in high school or college who may be feeling a call to ministry, there's really not much of anyone in their high school or college, maybe not in their congregation, that they can really talk with about this. So you might be the agent of identifying some people who could simply be together to think with one another.
Someone says, it seems to me one implication for booms in relation to the large number of 55 to 72-year-old clergy is to be sure these clergy continue to be trained, strengthened in using their gifts, and intentional training for mentoring younger clergy.
Oh, that sounds excellent. Wonderful suggestions.
And another question, what does it mean for white clergy that the UMC is becoming much more diverse?
Well, as I've said before, there's no future for any denomination in the United States that can't demonstrate that it can reach more people, younger people, and more diverse people. And number one, congregations are becoming more diverse. As recently as 2000, probably 75% of United Methodist churches were made up of only one race. That has come down dramatically. There's not a huge increase in truly multiracial congregations where no one race represents more than 80%. But churches are not as monolithic as one point. But all clergy have got to become more culturally sensitive to reach across various cultures. It may be age groups, it may be racial groups or ethnic groups. Our churches are going to have to show more sensitivity if we're going to reach people that are not just like the people who are there. And the people who are there, they're going to be fewer of them. And so if a pastor is not leading that effort, it's probably not going to happen.
What are the boom implications to address your comment that churches, quote, need to fall in love with their community again? I can see implications in training for more community-facing work, more people called to justice and community work, more training in how to connect church to community, more deacons, and more lay people connecting community to the church.
Yes, absolutely, all of those things. But think about this. The one thing that boards have a monopoly on is really reviewing clergy. And working with the Board of Ordained Ministry one time, I asked them to think about all the people who are involved in this assessment process who had a way to make contributions to whether someone's ordained. And then I asked them to rank the groups of which one of all these groups, which ones had the most influence and the most power in determining who was approved. And then I asked them to rank of these various groups, which ones had the most knowledge about how effective the candidates were, which of course effectiveness is the standard for ordination. And the board itself ranked very high on power, of course, but very low on really a lot of knowledge, whereas people in the congregations, they have minimal influence on the decision, but they have tremendous knowledge. So, and what kind of knowledge are you looking for? Look at they do a fruitfulness project. What is that connected with? What are their engagements in the community? If somebody moves through the provisional process and they've not engaged in the community, they don't know well people who are not members of their church, they have no partnerships in that, then they're probably not going to have those after the provisional process. So those are some things to review and encourage and to build into the provisional process, I think.
Dr. Weems, this is a short question that is a very large question. Looking at this data, what could we do to bring people back to the UMC?
Well, there are two things that congregations that are vital are doing. They're connecting people with God, and they're connecting with their communities. Churches are religious organizations. We are about connecting people with the ultimate religious meaning in life. People's lives should be changed. People should be growing as disciples. And their community should be different because of those churches. As I said, fall in love with your communities again. Say there are two churches in a community, and one church has been there 150 years, and the other church just started having worship services 6 months ago. Which of those two churches will have its finger on the pulse of the community the most? It's always the 6 months ago church, which makes no sense. It's counterintuitive. If you've been there 150 years, there shouldn't be anything that you don't know. But what happens is, the longer a church is in existence, the less familiar it tends to be with this community and the less connected. We are facing the same thing that now Southern Baptists are facing, Church of the Nazarene is facing a lot, that is, you're a mature denomination, you've been around a while, you have an established constituency. And when at first everything was outward oriented, now it becomes inward, taking care of your constituency, taking care of your facilities and all of that. And that's my main encouragement. And remind you, I'm happy to respond. There may be things that you'd like to follow up with. My email is loveitw@wesleyseminary.edu. And be happy always to hear from you. Some of us on the project staff can look into some things if you've got some follow-up questions. I think we do need to honor our time. Matt, is there anything you need to say in closing?
No, I Just wanted to remind people, if they are not already Leading Ideas subscribers, our free e-newsletter, to please subscribe at churchleadership.com/leading ideas. And also wanted to remind people about LPLI, which is the Lewis Pastoral Leadership Inventory, which is a confidential online 360 degrees leadership assessment instrument designed for those who work in the church. And that's at lpli.org. And now I will stop the advertisements.
Great. Well, good wishes to everyone. We'll continue to go over the questions and comments, and you'll be receiving information from us later today. Thank you so much for joining us, and goodbye.